Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to stately Vaughn Manor, where Roger and I are here to talk to you about Star Trek. Star Trek. Star Trek's my favorite television show. The original series is my favorite television show, actually, but I do like a lot Star Trek The Next Generation. Love that show. And I pretty much like all Star Trek. Big fan of Star Trek. And today we're talking about Book Trek 2023, which is a reading event created by Vin over at Revenant Reads. Fantastic channel. If you haven't seen that channel, you should watch it because it's fantastic, like I say. Great channel. And Vin is a big Star Trek fan as well, and he created in 2021 Book Trek. And so this is the third year of Book Trek. Book Trek was the first booktube event that I really got involved with, and I was really excited to do it. I was pretty small as a channel when Book Trek first happened, and I don't know, not too many people watched those Book Trek videos that I did, but I did a few Book Trek videos for the first Book Trek, and it was a lot of fun. I had a good time with it, and I have a lot of Star Trek books. And that's what the event is about. It's about Star Trek fiction. The fiction written about Star Trek, the series. All of the series. Now, Gene Roddenberry said about Star Trek fiction, he said that everything that you see on the screen, either on the television shows or in the films, everything you see on screen for Star Trek, that's all Star Trek fact. But the books are Star Trek fiction. So none of them are really canon, really, at least as far as I'm aware. But Star Trek fiction has played an important part of the phenomena of Star Trek. For a long time, in between the first television show and the first movie, there was a huge gap of time when if you wanted new Star Trek adventures, the only way you can get them was from reading a book. That was it. And the only way you could watch Star Trek at the time, was waiting for whenever it showed up on television, whenever that was. There were no VCRs. There was nothing like that. If you wanted to watch a show, you had to watch it when it came on, and that was it. I know, it sounds barbaric, but that's the way it was back in those olden days. So the Star Trek books were kind of important for Star Trek. And I've been buying Star Trek books off and on forever because I was a Star Trek fan. And then when Book Trek happened, I ordered a bunch of Star Trek books. And then some people sent me Star Trek books. And after the first Book Trek, I ordered like these big lots from eBay of Star Trek books. Some of which I've never really unpacked. I still have them in boxes. I know Steve Donoghue's going to not like to hear this, but I still have a bunch of these like in boxes. The boxes they came in, basically, I've still got them in the back. I've got a lot of Star Trek books. And then Steve Donoghue, speaking of Steve Donoghue, he beamed me a bunch of Star Trek books. A bunch of Star Trek ebooks. And he's threatened to beam me more, which, would be cool. I'll take whatever free Star Trek books I can get. Because I'm doing a project for Book Trek 2023. It's starting with Book Trek 20. What? Roger says I've got too many projects going on. Of course not. Me? No. That's ridiculous, Roger. So yeah, I've got a project going on because I've also got this 500 book challenge I have where I can't buy any new books until I read 500 books that I own. And Star Trek books tend to be short and they tend to be quick reads. So they'll help with the challenge, and I've got plenty of them. I might as well read them. So I thought, you know what? Starting with Book Trek this year, I'm going to just read every Star Trek book that I own in chronological order. And so my project is the Star Trek Chronicles. And the first Star Trek book was published in 1967. And every year, up through the first decade of the 21st century anyway, I'll have to check after that, but up to that time, every year Star Trek books were published. Some years, a lot of Star Trek books were published. I mean, there's a ton of Star Trek books out there. I don't have close to all of them. But I do have a lot of them. I mean, especially once, all the different shows came on. You had Voyager, before they had Deep Space Nine and Next Generation, and then you still had books being written about the original series. So, I mean, it was a flood of Star Trek books for a long time. Because they sold. Because Star Trek fans would buy these books. And it was that way from the very beginning. In 1967, when the show was still on television, the first Star Trek book was published. I'm just going to flash up pictures. I mean, I have all of these books, but I'm going to flash up some pictures here. Because today we're going to talk about the very beginning of the Star Trek phenomena as far as books were concerned. I'm going to talk about the first decade of the Star Trek fiction series, so starting in the late 60s up through the 70s. In the beginning, publishers had no idea that Star Trek books were going to sell this well. Back in those days, in the 60s, if you had a television show that was at all successful, even a little bit, they would hire somebody to write books about the show. And so Dark Shadows had a series of books that were very popular. Starsky and Hutch had a series of books that were popular. Space 1999 had a series of books. I mean, any show, pretty much, had a series of books about it. But the Star Trek books, they sold very well. And so the first Star Trek book showed up in 1967, and that was this one. This was Star Trek I by James Blish. So James Blish, science fiction author, was hired to write this book. He had never seen Star Trek. All he had to go on was a pile of shooting scripts that he had to novelize into short stories for this book. He had some photos for reference. He might have been given a little information about the show, but not much. And that's all he had. And you can tell when you read the books, because a lot of what we know about Star Trek had been invented since this time. And he had not seen any of the shows, like I said. So he was pretty much winging it. So it's kind of surprising that this book is as good as it is. Very readable, very entertaining book. And Star Trek fans, man, they loved it. So this was reprinted multiple times. Star Trek. This book, Star Trek, it was originally called Star Trek. Later it was called Star Trek I. Was published in January of 1967. And that was the only Star Trek book in 1967. But in 1968, the second book in the series came out. This came out in February. This is Star Trek II. More novelized episodes in this book. But also, later in 1968, Mission to Horatius by Mack Reynolds was published. This has the distinction of being the first Star Trek novel. It was a YA novel, as far as I understand. I haven't read it yet. I do have a copy of it. I have an ebook copy of it. I don't have a physical copy of this book. But I am going to read it as part of this project, since I've got an ebook copy of it. And it does have the distinction of being the very first Star Trek novel ever written. So that's kind of cool. So 2 books in 1968. In 1969, only 1 book. In April, Star Trek III by James Blish was published. More novelized episodes in that series. Then in 1970, in February of 1970, Spock Must Die came out. Now, this was also by James Blish, but this was an original novel by James Blish. So this book was a departure from the 3 books preceding it, in that it was an all-original novel that James Blish just made up, and it was very much a product of its time. So I'll be reading this again. It'll be interesting to revisit this again. I read this not too long ago. I read this a couple years ago, actually. Did I read this the first time Book Trek came around? I can't remember. I might have. I'll have to check. I have to check those old episodes that I did on the original Book Trek. But Spock Must Die by James Blish. And so then in 1971, in July of 1971, Star Trek IV by James Blish came out. The 4th book in the series of novelized episodes. So far, every year we've had a book or 2. But then, in 1972, in February, Star Trek V came out. In April, Star Trek 6 came out. In July, Star Trek 7 came out. And then in November, Star Trek 8 came out. So the publisher must have figured out by this point, wow, these things are selling like crazy. We got to pump out some Star Trek books so we can sell them all. So pretty much they put 4 Star Trek books out. A lot of Star Trek. And so the following year in 73, in February, Star Trek 9 came out, but that was the only book that came out in 1973. I guess because all those other Star Trek books were still out there on the shelves. But then in 1974, Star Trek 10 came out, rolling right along with James Blish's series. But in June of 1974, Star Trek Log 1 came out by Alan Dean Foster. Now this was a book that was kind of like James Blish's series in that it was a book of novelized episodes, but it was novelized episodes from the cartoon series because there was a Star Trek cartoon, which I've never seen a lot of. I think I saw a couple episodes when I was a kid, and I don't remember them like at all, and I've never seen them as an adult. But these are the novelized episodes. Now, Alan Dean Foster padded these out, so there's only like 3 or 4 episodes, I think, to a book. I've never read them. I have them now, but I've never read them. I hear they're pretty good, actually. Alan Dean Foster is a really good writer. And he is the king of movie novelizations. So he knows how to take a script and make a book out of it. So, yeah, the first one of this series, Star Trek Log 1. And then in September of 1974, Star Trek Log 2 came out by Alan Dean Foster. So I'm sure these sold just as well as the books on the original series. Then in 1975, in January, Star Trek Log 3 came out, the third book in Alan Dean Foster's series. In April, Star Trek 11 came out by James Blish. In May, Star Trek Log 4 came out by Alan Dean Foster. That's May 1975. And then in July 1975, Star Trek Log 5 came out. So, yeah, that's a lot of Star Trek. And so publishers had caught on by now that Star Trek sells, right? And so they just get more and more books from there. In 1976, in March, The New Voyages by Sandra Marshak and Myrna Colbreth came out. I've never read this. I have an ebook copy of this, I think. Do I have a physical copy? I don't think so. I think I've only got an ebook copy of this that Steve sent me, actually. So I've got Star Trek The New Voyages. That came in March of 1976. In May, Star Trek Log 6 came out from Alan Dean Foster. In June, Star Trek Log 7 came out from Alan Dean Foster. In August, Star Trek Log 8 came out from Alan Dean Foster. And in September came out an original novel, Spock Messiah, by Theodore Cogswell and Charles A. Spano Jr. Now, this is a novel which is kind of notorious for its weirdness. I hear it's pretty bad. I hear this is not a great book. I haven't read it. I've got a copy of it. So I will be reading it, but I hear it's pretty much terrible. I hear this book is terrible. We'll see. A lot of the early Star Trek fiction was a little weird. And this is like the high point of weird, I think, Spock Messiah for Star Trek books. 1977, February of 1977, Star Trek Log 9 by Alan Dean Foster came out. Then in July, another novel, The Price of the Phoenix by Sandra Marshak and Myrna Colbreth. This is a book I've never read. These late 70s books I haven't read. I've got them, but I haven't read them. So that's The Price of the Phoenix. Then in August, Planet of Judgment came out by Joe Haldeman. A Star Trek book by Joe Haldeman. So, yeah, I'm kind of excited to read that. I'm excited to read a lot of these. So that was 1977. Okay, Roger pointed out that I forgot this one when I was going through my list. I forgot this book from November 1977, Star Trek 12, James Blish with J.A. Lawrence. This is the final book in this series of novelized episodes. So this has 5 episodes, and this ends the James Blish series of television novelizations. And the cover is not really all that great. The Enterprise looks a little odd here, but what do you do? 1978. January, The New Voyages 2 by Sandra Marshak and Myrna Colbreth. Also in January, Log 10. This is the last book in the Log series by Alan Dean Foster, so the last of the animated series novelized episodes. Then in May, Mud's Angels by J.A. Lawrence came out. That had the episodes that were not included in the original Star Trek book series, which were the episodes that have to do with Harry Mudd, the character Harry Mudd. And also I think there's an original story in there about Harry Mudd as well. So that's Mud's Angels. Then in September, Vulcan by Kathleen Sky. Now I read this last year, Vulcan. I'm not going to read it again because it was terrible. This is a terrible book, in my opinion, Vulcan by Kathleen Sky, because none of the characters really acted like themselves. Which, if you're going to write a book about a television show, make the characters act like themselves. And frankly, the plot was preposterous. So, it's one of those books, read it if you feel you really have to. Otherwise, maybe don't. Read Vulcan by Kathleen Sky. And then November, The Starless World by Gordon Eklund. The Starless World by Gordon Eklund. Another original novel. And so then we're moving into the last year of the 1970s. 1979, January, Trek to Mad World by Stephen Golden. In February of 1979, World Without End by Joe Haldeman. In May of 1979, The Fate of the Phoenix by Sandra Marshak and Myrna Colbreth. In November of 1979, Devil World by Gordon Eklund. And then, in December, we've got Star Trek The Motion Picture by Gene Roddenberry. So we're ending today with Star Trek The Motion Picture. Those are all the books that came out in the 70s. So you see in the beginning of the 70s, or late 60s, early 70s, a few Star Trek books coming out once in a while. And then, boom, a ton of Star Trek books because these things were selling. Now, after the 70s, after the motion picture, there were a couple other original novels, and then there was another line of novels that came out that were kind of based on the time of the motion picture and after that of the original crew. And that series of novels lasted years and years and years. I'll go into that in another episode. But today you saw the beginning of the Star Trek phenomena. If you want to read about it, you can pick up this book, paperback, this magazine, Paperback Parade. This is Gary Levisi's magazine about paperback collecting. This is issue 112, and it has a bunch of articles in this about the original line of Star Trek books, the early years of the Star Trek books, and has some great reproductions of the covers. Really cool articles about all these original books, so I highly recommend this if you can get a copy of it. I think you can get a copy of this somewhere, but I'll be reading this again for Book Trek, as well as all of those books from the 1960s and 70s, and then eventually I'll get to the others. But that's a lot of books to start off with for the Star Trek Chronicles, and then all the other books which I have, I'll be reading those in chronological order. And like I said, once the other television shows started coming out, all the books based on those shows came out, they all sold. A ton of Star Trek books were published. And so as far as books produced on a television show and films, the Star Trek books have been tremendously successful. It's been an enduring publishing phenomena for a long time. They kind of fell off for a while, I think, in the second decade of the 21st century, the teens. I think they kind of fell off somewhere around there because for a while Star Trek was kind of, it wasn't such a big deal. There were no television shows for a long time. We had the films that came out, those 3 movies that came out with the new cast from the Kelvin timeline. But now Star Trek seems to be back in business on television. And so I foresee many, many, many more Star Trek books being published off of those new series. We'll see how it goes. But I don't see Star Trek books disappearing anytime soon. I think they're probably going to be continuing to be published every year for the foreseeable future. But that's all I have to say about them today for Book Trek. Catch me on Wednesday when I'll be talking about comic books and something else on Thursday. I will catch you next time.